You're listening to Word for Word at the Bryant Park Reading Room. Sandra Beasley, June 8th, 2010.
Thank you, Paul, for that gracious introduction and hosting. Thank you, Jack, David, and Maya, for a wonderful lineup of poetry tonight. I'm happy to back clean up, so to speak. And I also want to thank my compatriots at W.W. Norton, a few of whom are here this evening. I really appreciate your support and all you've done for this book. So let's just get started. I want to open with a poem called Immortality that deals with the reality that we all face at some point in our life, that we will probably not end up being quite as famous as we thought we might get to be when we were kids. Immortality. Face it, I will never appear on the flip side of a nickel, or as a balloon floating down Fifth Avenue. No one will give my name to a variety of rosebush, or a way to throw fastballs, or a beetle with 4 strange silvery wings. They say my spit's helixes will swim in the children of my children, but that's nothing more than simple whipgraft, the way a pear tree is bullied into fruit. My heart is one yellow marble, waiting in a swarm of yellow marbles, waiting for someone to chalk the lines of play, waiting for the thumb of God. Inertia is a poor man's immortality. Even the ancient recipes have failed us now. No more gilded eyelids or canopic jars. No more baklava baking in the crypt of my jaw. Call me selfish, but who doesn't dream of being both kite and wind, boat and ocean? I want to be the ball and the bat and the mound and the sweat and the grass. I want to be the vampire who drinks a tall, cool glass of me so he can live forever. I wrote, everybody hits writer's block at times, and people will sometimes ask me what I do when those moments happen. And I started writing a series of poems where I titled them failed poems. It was another failed poem about music, another failed poem about starlings, and this one, another failed poem about the Greeks. And it was kind of playing with the idea that if you call it a failed poem at the outset, you can really only go upwards from there. You're setting yourself up for a softball. But having written the poems, I think it's also in a way about these iconic topics that poetry returns to again and again. And it's kind of like, how do you find your unique toehold in it? And in this case, it was this totally random image that I could not get rid of a contemporary woman opening her front door to find a fully regaliaed Greek warrior standing on her doorstep. This is another failed poem about the Greeks. His sword dripped blood, his helmet gleamed, he dragged a Gorgon's head behind him. As first dates go, this was problematic. He itched and fidgeted. He said, "Could I save something for you?" But I was all out of maidens bound to rocks. So I took him on a roller coaster, wedging in next to his breast-plated body in the little car. He put his arm around me, as the Greeks do. On the first dip, he laughed. On the first drop, he clutched my shoulder and screamed like a catamite. When we ratcheted to a full stop, he said, "Again." We went on the scrambler, the apple turnover, the log flume. We went on the pirate ship 3 times, swooshing forward, back, upside down, and he cried, waving his sword, until the operator asked him to please keep all swords inside the car. He was a good sport, letting the drachmas fall out of his pockets, sparing the girl who spilled punch on his shield, waving as I rode the carousel's hippogriff, though it was a slow ride, and I made him hold my purse. On the way home, he said, we should do this again sometime, though we both knew it would never happen, since he was Greek, of course, and dead, and somewhere a maiden rattled in her chains. And I don't have a lot of New York poems, but I thought I'd read another one of the failed poems, which in this case is another failed poem about starlings. And for those of you who don't know, starlings, which are now quite ubiquitous and somewhat of a pest, were not originally indigenous to the United States. They were brought into the United States by this kooky guy named Eugene Schieffelin, who believed that all of the birds mentioned in Shakespeare's plays should be brought into America. So he brought 100 starlings over from England and released them in New York, and they certainly made a home here. So the epigraph of this poem is actually that one snippet from Shakespeare that mentions starlings. It's from Henry IV, Part 1, Act 1, Scene 3, and it's, I'll have a starling shall be taught to speak nothing but Mortimer, and give it to him to keep his anger still in motion. It refers to the fact that starlings are a mimic of a bird. This is another failed poem about starlings. You need to know they have no call of their own, only what they are given. You need to know Eugene Schieffelin was rich and dreamed of bringing the birds of Shakespeare to America. And as he stood in Central Park releasing handfuls of starlings, sternus vulgaris, we applauded as they settled into the eaves of a museum. Now, 100 years and 200 million starlings later, their fat mimicry crowds every nest. They rise in flocks of 10,000, devour cherries by the metric ton, wrestle small planes to the ground. You need to know we've tried everything. Plastic owls, Cobalt 60, our government's best recipe for starling pie. In Illinois, a man is teaching starlings to speak, wiring his farm with the murmur of Schieffelin, 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 so that we might know the monster by the name of its Frankenstein. You need to know how light they were, lifting from his hands, their bodies shimmering with hunger. As Paul was kind enough to mention, a lot of these poems play with kind of exotic voices, and one of the voices that the poetry occupies is that of Osiris, the Egyptian god. And for those who don't know, just the brief shorthand, Osiris was murdered and dismembered, and the parts of his body cast all over the world. And his goddess wife, Isis, knew that if she could gather up the parts of his body, he could be reincarnated. And so she traveled the world, grabbing body parts here and there, and had a fair amount of success. Unfortunately, she did not get to one of his most kingly body parts, shall we say, in time, one below the waist, which was swallowed by a fish before he could get to it. And so that part of him was not able to be reincarnated in its original form. And in Egypt, where they believe you are what you eat, fish to this day is still considered a less than desirable dinner entree. But this is in the voice of Osiris speaking to his wife. Osiris speaks. I left my heart in San Francisco. I left my viscera in the Netherlands. I left my liver on the 42 line, headed from Farragut Square to the White House. I left my occipital lobe in Reno. I left my corneas in Tangier. I left 1 foot in a courthouse and 1 in a traveling circus. I had hoped to find you, Isis, before the fish swam between my legs and swallowed. But now I navigate the Seine, sharing a scaled belly with the ashes of Joan of Arc. So I left my pride in Paris. I left a vertebra in Venice. On Murano, my clavicle became the mouth of a bowl. I left my mouth on Mount Everest, holding every apology I had meant to offer. And while they chattered in sad fury, I sowed my teeth in an Arctic field. Now there is little left of me, fingers with nothing to tickle, hands with nothing to grasp. The small bones of my ears do their xylophone dance, while the small cusps of my wrist bones pretend to be ears. Every king, in the end, is his only audience. Every queen picks up the pieces. Isis, every fish in that river is a child of mine. You are my net. Hold me.